Thank you very much for coming along today. Today we'll be in conversation with the lovely Michael Cusack, who's joined us. He's flown in today especially, and there was a threat that he wouldn't make it. There were some cancelled flights. Michael, you were born in Dublin but have lived in Australia since 1982. This is your 18th year exhibiting and first exhibition at OLSEN. What led you to painting?
It was a long road for me to get to painting, actually, because I started in Dublin in photography. I was more interested, when I was growing up, I was more interested in photographic image, and I did that for many years. I wandered the streets of Dublin when I was about 17, 18, taking photographs. So, I was interested in photojournalism. I worked in photographic laboratories, and I did that when I moved to Australia. I always did draw, and I was always interested in the mark and making marks, etc. But I didn't go to art school until in my 30s. I went to art school in Newcastle, in New South Wales. And yeah, I got a lucky break just after that. Newcastle was a very supportive town. There was a lady called Anne von Berto, which was Anne von Berto Galleries. And she was very supportive of students, and she would give us opportunities to show our work. And it sort of started from there. Nick Mitrovic, who's now the National Gallery of Australia director, had his gallery there. He just started his own gallery in a squash court in Newcastle, and I had a show there with Nick back in the day, and he introduced me to galleries in Sydney.
That's a very good entree.
A good entree. Nick was, tremendous.
Yeah, amazing. Oh, good. You did your Masters only recently in visual arts on Samuel Beckett and abstraction at Queensland College of Art. Yeah. This was just in 2016.
Yeah, it was a two-year Masters, and I completed that. I've always been interested in Beckett, always been interested in writing. Growing up in Ireland, it's very much part of the psyche of the Irish spirit, I think, writing and music, more than painting. And when I grew up, I didn't grew up looking at lots of paintings, so that came much later. But the creative work of Beckett and a number of other Irish writers were big inspirations for me. And in my Masters, I was looking at Beckett's philosophy.
Yes.
Which is...
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. How have Beckett's ideas on the inexpressible and the gaps between words influenced the way you paint? Because you've talked about that.
Yeah, well, I kind of used that as a foil in my Masters as to make a body of work.
Yeah.
That I wasn't trying to make. I was more interested... My work has always had a minimal bent to it.
Yeah.
It's quite pared back. And I saw that as a way to leave things out, as opposed to putting things in all the time. Now I'm starting to explore more painterly aspects, but I've always been interested in the gap. It's sort of like the inexpressible. In creating a painting, there's not one thing we know about, but maybe it's a new thing we don't know about. I align myself with Beckett's. Beckett was very interested in painting himself. He supported quite a number of artists at the time.
I did not know that.
Yeah, he was. And, that inexpressibility, he talks about nothing to express, nothing with which to express it. Sounds a bit dour, doesn't it?
Yes.
But you'll continue to express anyway. And, it's like that in the studio, I think. I kind of visit that.
Go between those three states.
It's just a playful act.
Yeah. Look, the title of the exhibition is something that we've been asked a lot about, no history but in things. And it's a reference to William Carlos Williams, the American 50s poet, who laid down that mantra, the mantra, no ideas but in things.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that title?
Yeah. It's a way of, I guess William Carlos Williams was a very forward-thinking poet and was trying to strip bare the idea of having no ideas. Now, for myself in the studio, sometimes ideas are quite useless. You kind of get in and do the work. The inspiration may be, the beginning of a few brush marks, but the rest of it's work. And the idea that I'll leave my ideas at the door of the studio and let the materials do the work is something I try and practice. So I
very interesting.
have kind of lots of ideas, some of them ridiculous, but I have lots of ideas that I generate, but I do try and not implement those ideas. I don't make paintings to implement an idea.
Very interesting.
I try and get the ideas out of the materials in the studios.
Okay, so is it more a meditation if you're trying to get rid of ideas and thoughts?
It's more of a discipline. It's sort of like, I do a lot of research. I'm a teacher, an educator, so I'm doing a lot of research into different artists and, the history of. So I try to leave that at the door. And the no history but on things is kind of, I use a lot of found objects in my studio.
Yeah.
And I'm using those things. So they're the history carriers. It's not ideas.
Okay.
So it's a little bit abstract.
Sorry to interrupt. Where are we seeing the found objects in this body of work?
Well, you might see them in some of the shapes that are in there. You might see it in this painting here, which are bits of piano, and these two shapes here, this one here and the one on the back wall there, are actually the inside of a piano. The back shape of a piano. So they were in my studio, and piano was way out of tune, and it was actually a lot cheaper to take the piano apart and try and get it moved. So my wife and I did that. We took it apart, and inside is this shape, and I'm interested in shapes. And
Fantastic.
So that shape still is in my studio in its original form. So it's the beginning of this losing the rectangle and trying that out. And
very interesting. I hadn't noticed that repetition.
Yeah.
So you have spoken of the influence of, Irish writers and the influence of writing generally. Who, other than Beckett, are the core influences?
Well, I think Joyce and a lot of Irish poets, Patrick Kavanagh, you probably wouldn't have heard of, but that's really was the mainstay of what we grew up with. But Joyce was another groundbreaker in Irish literature. So Beckett was Joyce was adding words, adding new language to the English language. He was embellishing continuously, or he was breaking English language up in an abstract sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
We just talked about Finnegan's Wake there. If anybody's read that, it's quite
very
broken,
abstract.
Very abstract. Not for the faint-hearted.
No, not at all.
But pretty powerful stuff. And Beckett was doing the opposite of that. He wanted to strip it all away. Beckett worked for Joyce for a while, went out with his daughter, and there was kind of different intermingled stories there. But he was, with the English language, trying to undo the language. And actually he was fluent in French, and he wrote everything he did in French and then translated it all back into English rather than writing in English, because he was trying to corrupt the language.
Yeah.
So all that corruption kind of it feeds into abstraction in terms of corrupting images, and images not being specific to a certain thing or place or time, that you're trying to make so I'm trying to make a new language out of what I'm doing.
Given that the writers that you reference are Irish and sort of from your
or American,
and from your childhood, do these works reference Ireland?
Yeah, I think there's always an autobiographical aspect to the work. With the history, no history, but the things. But there is, that is embedded in the work, and some works would speak to Ireland more than others.
Yeah. Okay.
But definitely, my work is autobiographical. And if I'm not being specific about what a work is, if I'm trying to say it's nothing in particular, it's non-relational, is what we would say, then I'm just looking back. It's kind of within inside me.
Yeah.
So there's another force at work.
In terms of other influences, are you influenced by film, music?
I'm influenced by all of those. I listen to a lot of music, definitely film, and a lot of painters. I'm always looking at, I love Philip Guston and the whole history of painting. I'm looking at Richard Diebenkorn and sort of growing up looking at that stuff, and it feeds in subliminally into what I do.
The work.
Into the work.
So before I finish, what does a day in the life of Michael Cusack look like?
well, it depends which day it is. But for this body of work, this was a very concentrated, I had a big space and time. So I've had an idea of the shape of what the work needed to be, what I wanted it to be, and I had, you know, a good spell of time in the studio unbroken, which is very rare because I teach and educate, work at the uni and with Barnes School of Art, so it's often broken time.
Yeah.
But for this body of work in particular, I had a concentrated period of morning till night working on it every day, and that's been
quite a luxury.
That's
isn't
a
it?
great experience, and it's what I'll continue to do as I paint shows or make work.
So I gather from you're of the belief that it's more hard work than sort of just that notion of inspiration, more perspiration.
I think, yeah, and I'll just use, there's an Irish writer called Colm Tobin, I don't know if anybody's heard of him. Anyway, he talks about, you know, walking inspiration for a book where he's walking back with the shopping and he's got to put the shopping down, and he gets one line or maybe two lines, and that's the book. That's it. That's all he gets as inspiration. The rest is him going to a house in Wexford or wherever it is in Barcelona and writing the book.
Yeah.
And I kind of think it's a bit like that.
Yeah.
I don't, you know, it's good work.
Yeah.
It's not bad work.
No, it's great work. So what is next before we open up to the floor? What's next? What's next on? Do you have your next show planned? Are you working on a new body of work at the moment?
I'm beginning to work on a new body of work. I haven't painted since this show was completed, so I've down tools.
Great.
My studio is still a big mess, so I'm trying to clean that up as much as possible, and then I'll begin a new body of work. I'm just getting stretches and collecting. I tend to work in my studio. I begin the work, and they don't have form or structure for quite a long time, but they need that kind of input and layering and all that stuff before they take on a form or arrive at something that's something I can work with.
Great, yeah.
But there's an increased investigation of paint.
Yes, you can see,
and
see that.
That's what I'm excited about, is digging in and getting into that.
You are using, when we talked about this, you've been using more paint than you previously had.
Yeah.
And also collage is new to the...
Yeah, I've been cannibalizing the paintings. I've been, making two paintings, cutting two paintings up and making one painting. I do a lot of collage anyhow, but this is a new way to do it in scale, and I like that juxtapose, and I like the problems that arises out of that.
Is this the first time you've used a geometric canvas?
This is the first time I've used a geometric, and it was probably, it wasn't easy to resolve those, but
They were.
that's a challenge for those.
You've also incorporated the frame outside the behind the artwork.
Yeah.
Is that a compositional device, or is that something that was a bit of an accident? Did it happen by chance?
Yeah, it was a bit of an accident in my studio. I had some stretchers hanging up, and I was walking one of the paintings past, and I just, said, "Oh, that looks actually quite interesting." I'm interested in those sculptural structures anyway.
Yeah.
I kind of always had this idea of putting painting in cages, and I've actually had caged paintings before.
Oh,
so it's like a painting in a cage, as opposed to being...
So it becomes an object.
More of an object, more 3D. And I'm interested in painting as a three-dimensional language, and how it comes onto the floor and how it works like that. So I'm interested in pushing all that, and I certainly push that with all my students.
So pushing the boundaries of what painting is,
Yeah.
exploring paint, texture, what you can do,
Yeah.
the boundaries of the nature of
And scale.
painting.
Next thing is, I think, larger scale.
Very interesting. Does anyone have any questions for Michael about his practice? Anyone?
I could ask something. I'm really interested to hear about your thoughts behind Beckett and how it relates to your painting. And it makes me think of discussions we've had about novels and books, and how you're less interested or not engaged by the narrative because can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, Rowena and I have spoken about, I guess, growing up, reading a lot, at some stage, tragically or not, became less interested in the novel and became very suspicious or didn't believe the novel anymore. I couldn't go past a few pages of a novel because I could see the construct of a novel. Maybe I wasn't reading the right writers anymore. And I guess I was reading a lot of academic books, so I was probably taking that away. But that aspect, is an interesting. Beckett is much more philosophical, and he writes his play. Beckett is not just a playwright. He writes for television, which is completely different. He writes for radio, which is also completely different, and he writes novels, which are completely different, and he also writes philosophical thought. So there's a whole different, Beckett in one genre is different to Beckett in another,
Right.
So he actually wrote some plays for the BBC, which the BBC rejected because they weren't TV enough, which is kind of interesting with Beckett.
Very interesting.
Did I answer your question, maybe?
Does anyone else have any other questions? No?
Sure.
Sure. Michael, thank you very much.
Pleasure, thank
for
you.
talking with us today. That was very, very interesting.
Excellent.
And Michael will be here for the next hour or so if you want to have a chat to him about any of the works or any of your interests. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks a lot.